This gruesome infection in HBO's The Last of Us is actually based on this very real parasitic fungus that turns certain insects into zombies.
Growing from her head, that is the fruiting body that contains the spores.
The creators of the game and the new show were inspired by zombie carpenter ants specifically. They even gave the bugs a quick cameo.
So it's a pretty cool...
Diseases can make us ill, but fungi can alter our very minds.
One thing it does right, where a lot of movies do it wrong, is that the infected are still alive when they're manipulated. There's lots of examples of this in nature.
The brains of living crickets, cockroaches, and even mammals can get hijacked by different types of zombie parasites that alter their behavior. New research shows that gray wolves get infected with toxoplasma by interacting with cougars and their feces, which carry the parasite.
Those that are infected are more risk-taking, more bold, becoming the leader of the pack. The behaviors that we're seeing are rather complex.
And in the case of ants, the cordyceps parasite spreads throughout the body as a yeast, which secretes chemicals that behave similarly to neurotransmitters in the brain.
It looks like the fungus is avoiding the nervous tissue. It's not chewing on it, it's not eating it. These cells might be close to the brain and then secretes molecules that are manipulated in such a way that it behaves so precisely to help this fungus spread.
In the first stage, the infected humans don't show outward signs of their condition.
In the beginning, the ants don't behave differently. After a few days, you see that the behavior of the ants definitely is changing.
In the video game, it starts with a twitch.
Twitching, we also see this in our ants. They seem to have sometimes whole body convulsions. The fungus is producing a compound that is similar to aflatrim. Certain fungi produce this, and when an animal ingests this, they get Stagger's syndrome. So they get these tremors.
Then the humans in The Last of Us get a little hyper, moving at high speed as if stimulated by chemicals excreted by the fungus. A similar thing happens with the zombies in Professor De Becker's lab.
They're out and about all times of the day, in constant locomotion.
Soon, The Last of Us runners lose the ability to speak. So do infected ants, in a sense.
They don't communicate so well with other nestmates anymore. Ants will sniff each other out with their antennae. The smell of these ants definitely change. So if an ant starts to smell differently because she is sick, they basically will kill her and put her on a discard pile.
There might be a similar social immunity dynamic at play in The Last of Us.
I see a pile of humans infected by this fungus and sprouting mushroom bodies. Definitely a pile I wouldn't want to get near, you know?
Stage 2, the stalker phase of The Last of Us zombies, is characterized by obvious fungal growth.
The stalker definitely...
Parasitic Masopora fungus radically transforms its host's physical shape and gives it a desire to seek out new hosts to infect.
This cicada, you'll see that it's missing a part. It's behind its genitals, aptly named the butt fungus because it loses its butt. That's a fungal plug, and the powder are the fungal spores. This is how the fungus is able to release its spores and infect other cicada. In the game and in the show, this fungus is able to reproduce by biting other humans or by contact with spores off of other humans that have these fruiting bodies sprouting off of them. Mesospora resembles the fungus in the game a little bit.
Because in The Last of Us and in nature, zombies have increased energy and they start to spread out and wander.
Normally, these ants would go forage for food with their nestmates and nicely follow ant trails. Instead, they actually just wander around aimlessly.
Could a similar wandering dynamic be at play with gray wolves infected with a protozoan parasite?
Wolves infected with toxoplasma are more likely to wander away from their former pack to find a new one and are more risk-taking, more bold.
The wolves studied recently in Yellowstone National Park could be drifting nearer to the source of their infection, cougars, because toxoplasma reproduces only in the stomach of felines. In The Last of Us, during the
at certain light levels, because they don't perceive light so well anymore and they're trying to search for it, or they're getting themselves off the ground. This is what we call summiting behavior, something that a lot of parasites have evolved to use as a strategy to transmit better. The fungus is making the ant find some sort of microclimate that helps the fungus to develop its mushroom that releases the spores. But if you're higher up in the air, then your spores can be more easily carried by the wind
and can land on or be eaten by a new host. Another example of infected hosts acting in the interest of their parasite are cockroaches that get stung by jewel wasps, which inject their victims with a kind of mind control venom, along with a brood of eggs.
This changes the behavior of the cockroach entirely. It doesn't want to fight anymore. It's this very docile creature that then follows the wasp back to its burrow. It gets eaten alive by this developing egg that eventually becomes a larva. And not a situation that is beneficial to this cockroach, but very beneficial to the offspring of the wasp.
Similarly, crickets infected by the Gordian worm are compelled to act self-destructively.
The worm needs to be in water to mate. So what this worm does is it makes these crickets jump into water. This cricket has no business being in the water, so basically they have committed suicide.
And now the worm can breed in its natural habitat, the water. A similar process happens with toxoplasma in mice, which breeds in the digestive system of cats.
Rodents that get infected with toxoplasmosis actually makes these rodents attracted to cat urine. It's making it more likely that this rodent will get eaten. Definitely behavior that is beneficial to toxoplasma, but absolutely not for the rodent.
In The Last of Us game completely takes about 3 weeks. And the beginning of the end starts with a hypercontraction of the jaw muscles. Ants bite a branch, can't let go, and die as they're eaten by the fungus within.
When the ant is in place, the fungus quickly changes its strategy and starts to eat everything, including the brain, to produce a fruiting body. This is when the fungus will change from being a yeast to forming a mycelium. Everything inside is just mycelium bursting out of the host. So this is what we often call the stalk. You see that on that stalk there's this brown bulbous thing attached. That's the fruiting body, so that carries the spores. Those are all mushrooms, if you will. Those are all fruiting bodies. As the spore gets into the air and as the air moves, it can easily take it to different places. So this is why we think that the summiting behavior is actually helping the fungus to spread its spores. See this spore cloud? Those are a lot of spores.
Years later, he was gone. He was forced to resign, and in his place, an obedient servant of the federal agencies called Gerald Ford took over the White House. How did that happen? Well, it's a long story, but here are the highlights, and they tell you a lot. Richard Nixon believed that elements in the federal bureaucracy were working to undermine the American system of government, and had been doing that for a long time. He often said that. He was absolutely right. On June 23, 1972, Nixon met with the then CIA Director Richard Helms at the White House. During the conversation, which thankfully was tape recorded, Nixon suggested he knew, quote, who shot John, meaning President John F. Kennedy. Nixon further implied that the CIA was directly involved in Kennedy's assassination, which we now know it was. Helms's telling response? Total silence. But for Nixon, it didn't matter because it was already over. 4 days before, on June 19th, the Washington Post had published the first of many stories about a break-in at the Watergate office building. Unbeknownst to Nixon and unreported by the Washington Post, 4 of the 5 burglars worked for the CIA. Less than 2 years later, he was gone. He was forced to resign, and in his place, an obedient servant of the federal agencies called Gerald Ford took over the White House. How did that happen? Well, it's a long story, but here are the highlights, and they tell you a lot. Richard Nixon believed that elements in the federal bureaucracy were working to undermine the American system of government, and had been doing that for a long time. He often said that. He was absolutely right. On June 23, 1972, Nixon met with the then CIA Director Richard Helms at the White House. During the conversation, which thankfully was tape recorded, Nixon suggested he knew, quote, who shot John, meaning President John F. Kennedy. Nixon further implied that the CIA was directly involved in Kennedy's assassination, which we now know it was. Helms's telling response? Total silence. But for Nixon, it didn't matter because it was already over. 4 days before, on June 19th, the Washington Post had published the first of many stories about a break-in at the Watergate office building. Unbeknownst to Nixon and unreported by the Washington Post, 4 of the 5 burglars worked for the CIA. Less than 2 years later, he was gone. He was forced to resign, and in his place, an obedient servant of the federal agencies called Gerald.
In the presidential campaign of the year 2000, I made the comment that there were few major policy differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. And that was often interpreted as my saying there were no differences between the Republicans and the Democrats. My position, as I'm going to outline it this afternoon, is that there are differences between the two parties, but they're not different enough. Their convergence in fundamental similarities on the structure of power in our country represent a level that invites people to ask whether there is a flunk grade for these two parties, below which, when they fall below that flunk rate, it's time to do something much more fundamental than to simply settle for the least worst every 4 years. Settling for the least worst every 4 years assures that both parties will get worse, albeit one won't be quite as bad as the other. And the consequences for the country of a lack of vibrant competition over fundamental contentions of the distribution of power and wealth in our country are now apparent. Despite 20 years of economic growth, the majority of the workers are making less today in inflation-adjusted dollars than they made in 1968, when the economy, in terms of productive output per capita, was half of what it is today. They are making less than 1973, and they are making slightly less than 1979. This is unprecedented in American history. Usually where there's economic growth, it's a tide that raises all boats. At the present time, it seems to be a tide that raises all yachts. With the top 1% of the richest people in the country having an ever greater slice of the national income and the national wealth. More than that, of course, we have, by comparison with Western European countries, 20% on the average of child poverty. If you have a near poverty category, it goes much higher than that. In California, the poverty category and the near poverty category include 45% of the children in California. In Western Europe, most of the countries have essentially abolished child poverty. They've essentially abolished raw poverty. Countries like France, Germany, Scandinavian countries, the Benelux countries, to cite some examples. 30 to 40 years ago, these Western European democracies provided full maternity leave. They provided facilities to organize trade unions, which we do not have in our country.
The insurgents loyal to the Confederacy, as the Confederates have been defeated, but they were not dissolved and categorically quarantined. They were able to form and re-establish their militias held in secret as secret organizations and secret cults and functions of these natures arrange as the necessary obligation of the infection of the Confederacy, which has to derive the disillusionment of competence and definitions connected to words in order to facilitate dog whistles which generate their ability to reproduce their infection into the larger host, which upon maturity they will be destroying, at which point the general construct of the arranged insurrection derives from the mass suppression of the general public for the removal of the general power of the civilian base, centralizing it into the parasite, which, feeding upon it, generates the replacement system, allowing for the reproduction of the destruction of the system, at which point the destruction of the host allows for its reproduction for the infection of the prepared amongst other hosts or nations, at which point the Confederacy infecting the United States is generating its collaborations with the Great Reset and many of the other larger systems which have been prepared by their double agents as their Confederate insurgents, corrupting the systems, generate the ability to engage in coups against their nation, and these coups against their nation will trigger after the United States has been fully destroyed by the Confederacy, allowing for the spores to infect the rest of the insurgents, at which point the infection nation, the viral nation, the Confederate zombie apocalypse, generates the eradication of all non-compliance with the Satanist program, at which point all who are viewed as human will systematically be hunted and destroyed under the systems found in Revelation, as that one world infectionist government is the one world government from Revelation.
All right, let's talk about Mexico, because Mexico keeps pissing off the U.S. by trying to govern their own country.
Wow.
And the U.S. no le gusta.
Be careful, because they'll end up another Puerto Rico or Hawaii if they don't play ball. we'll just take over
worse.
the country.
Worse to me is the risk of ending up like India, where you end up where Monsanto got so entrenched in their agriculture that they basically had GMO modified grains that would not reseed, and so then the farmers had to buy brand new seed every single season, and they couldn't afford it. So the farmers actually started drinking the Monsanto pesticide that was required for their crops as a suicide protest.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah, no, that's been going on for years, actually.
What,
And it's
what
crazy,
do you mean by won't reseed?
They're created so that they won't reseed them. Like, you can't then take the. Remember, how we in our garden here will take
We
the
dry
corn,
out the corn.
We dry out the corn, and then we
replant
and then
it.
we replant that corn. Right? You can't do that with these seeds. They just won't do that. So you're reliant on them to give you the seeds for next season.
So they produce infertile crops?
Yes.
That's
Court cases, if you look on YouTube, there are open court cases where there are people saving seeds, and Monsanto is like going after them for saving seeds.
Yes.
I mean, it's unbelievable how much of our farming Monsanto controls.
Oh, when I lived in Montana, the ranchers had this problem, of course, because the seeds would blow across ranches, across highways. They had no control of it, and then they would go around, like the seed police would go and they'd find their Monsanto seeds on their ranches, but they didn't plant them because they had simply blown there. Didn't matter. So they would be fined as a result of it, and they'd be sued as a result of it. Like, you're using our corn, our seed, or not corn in Montana, but our seeds that you didn't pay for, are like our Roundup protected seeds or whatever, that you didn't pay for, that are growing on your land, and they're able to spot them, genetically spot them, and know exactly which is a Monsanto seed. It's really, really crazy.
I think it's just a lot like the egg thing. It's like the wrong people are getting blamed for the egg problem too. They can produce the eggs. They have the chickens. They have everything that it takes. But there's something that's failing somewhere else. So it's kind of the same thing. We have farmers at the ready to bring us food. It's just that they're not selecting the right farmers. They're subsidizing the wrong farmers to get us crap food instead of the good farmers and chicken producers, meat producers, and things to get us good food.
Yeah.
The Confederates are using their various connections through these systems to infect every aspect of our security mechanisms into complete control in desperation and reliance upon them in order to promote the 83 policy of the military engaged in feudalist abuses of the general public, which they cannot have a remedy against under the Nazi protocols derived by Project Paperclip, which is derived by the Nazis, which were derived by the Confederates, creating the Great Depression in order to fund the Nazis as payment for the blueprints in order to engage in these infection research as policies in a detached alternative area not impacted by the American restraints and political advantages of checks and balances or law and order.
Let me ask you, the Chief C.J. Davis, in my interview with her, she said that all the officers being black, it takes race off the table. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think that I understand what the chief was saying, and I think she really handled this situation in a very professional way. She moved swiftly. She ensured that those officers were removed from the department. She took all the necessary steps. But I think race is still on the table. When a culture of policing historically has treated those from different groups differently, even when the individuals are from that same group, that culture can still exist, and we have to zero in on it, being honest about it.
Look, what I'm trying to explain here is that there is a systemic reality of white supremacy that produces racist white cops and racial gatekeeping black and brown cops, okay? This is the reality, and this is what black people have to deal with. Now, there'll be people